we already cured cancer in mice many, many, many times, except that we never can do that in humans because humans are not giant mice. When we do infectious diseases, we keep giving them infections, we keep giving them cancer without painkillers. And so, these animals are literally the whole time in pain, in isolation. A big misunderstanding is people think like animal testing means that animals live good lives and at some point we just do something to them before we like humanely kill them.
Today, I invite Dr. Faraz Harsini to talk all about animal testing. We learn why it is very outdated and actually sets us back in terms of medical advancement. We also discuss the numerous alternatives that already exist, which can produce much more accurate and human-relevant results. We also discuss policy, outreach, education, and what we can do to influence change. This episode is packed with information, so let's jump right in.
Welcome to the Ecochat podcast. In each episode, we chat with experts in conservation, animal welfare, sustainability, or environmental science to learn how you and I can make a difference for the planet. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show.
Okay, where shall we start? How about we first define what is animal testing and what's the history?
Basically, I think the origin of animal testing is we had something new. We either were curious to see how bodies work, or we had something new that we wanted to test on ourselves. But of course, it could be dangerous. So we look around and we found the most defenseless kinds of animals that we got our hands on. And we basically said, well, let's try it on them. And like any other technology, I think at some point in history, we relied on animals, such as when you think about it, we used to rely on animals to deliver messages with pigeons, or we used horses for transportation. So, but at some point we advanced both morally and technologically. So today we recognize that horses are no longer good solutions for current scale and demand and quality of transportation. We know that pigeons are not the best thing if your house is being raided or you're in some emergency situation. If we were going to, rely on pigeons to deliver a message, we can see how many ways it can go wrong. So with animal testing, we are still relying on pigeon technology for messaging. So, which is why we need more education on that, to basically learn what alternatives are available and how we can pretty much advance to a world where we don't abuse animals for testing anymore.
So fast forward to today. What's the state of animal testing today? Like, what are some of the most common use cases and what are the most common species being used?
Yeah, there are several ways that animals are used in science. It includes dissection, and trainings. So that could be like high school training. It could be surgery training. Sometimes military uses animals such as pigs to look at the impact of different guns and different impacts, radiation, stuff like that. But majority of it, of course, is animals used in biomedical research and used for testing for food or cosmetics. And that ranges, that covers a whole lot of animals such as, of course, rats, mice, horses, dogs, birds. And, of course, then you have labs that study certain like animals. So like, owls and different birds and different species. But majority of them, of course, are rats and mice and dogs and monkeys and, other primates.
Okay, so to summarize, the main areas of animal testing today would be biomedical research and also food and cosmetic testing. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, can you give us more details on each one of these?
So, for instance, if you think about like cancer research, what typically is done is that you inject mice or other animals with cancerous cells, and you let the cancer cells grow and form a tumor or multiple tumors. And then you test your therapy, whether it's a chemical, whether it's a chemo, whether it's radiation, surgery, whatever that might be. And then you basically test that. Other way to do that is, for instance, it's called knockout animals. So you want to build a model for certain diseases. You're suspicious that certain genes cause certain diseases. So they go and basically activate or inactivate certain genes. So animals are even born with certain diseases or show the same symptoms. It could be also, another instance is looking at therapeutics for burning and infection and stuff like that. So oftentimes they shave animals' body and then they burn them, and then they put the drug that they're studying. And of course, every time you have a control too. So you burn an animal, but you don't treat them, and then you burn the other, and you put the treatment, the lotion or whatever you're looking at on their skin, and just see how they heal. That's one thing. Another thing is, for instance, you already have a drug, it's safe, but you have to look at the drug concentration in their body, right? So let's inject mice with, whatever antibody, whatever vaccine, whatever drug that you're studying, and measure the concentration in their plasma after 1 hour, after 2 hours, and just see how they're secreting the product out, how they're metabolizing the product. And and lastly, there is also the amount of drug or any given chemical that can actually kill an animal. So let's just force feed mice with, let's say, literally anything. Imagine if it's a new food, if it's a new drug, we just have to overfeed or overdose animals and just understand at what concentration this becomes deadly in different animals, which can be informative, but at the same time, it can be misleading.
Right. This is to calculate the lethal dose amount, right?
Correct. But just something to point out here is that anything that we do to animals, we learn something about it, right? So I could, do something crazy to an animal and just see what they do. So anything that we do, we're going to learn something. But the question should be, do we have a better way to learn the same thing? And the thing that we are learning from it, is it applicable to humans? So yes, I may learn how to cure cancer in this mouse, but can I apply that to humans? So that's something to consider.
So you mentioned a few examples there, and I don't know about anyone else listening, but to me, when I hear that, for example, you burn the animal to test out a treatment, but then for the control, you need to compare it objectively. So you burn another animal, but you don't treat it. So you just cause it pain just because. Or, injecting cancer into a mouse. Or even worse, like you said, modifying the DNA so that it's already born with cancer and it lives a horrible life from the start. Or here's another one that really resonates with me: overdosing the animal with everything. Anything and everything, whether it's a drug or food or cosmetic, in order to test out the lethal dose amount. I mean, all of this sounds unethical and unnecessary. So what's the justification to keep doing this?
Yeah, I mean, you're making a good point here. The fact that I think a big misunderstanding is people think like animal testing means that, animals live good lives, and at some point we just do something to them before we humanely kill them. Or that a lot of times promoters of animal testing, they say, we put animals down before we, harvest their organs or whatever. But something to consider is that these animals suffer throughout the entire process, from the moment that, imagine they're born with cancer. Just think about some person like a human who has like major infection. I always say, just imagine yourself having like a simple flu or like a cold, right? You're miserable. You don't want to do anything. Imagine how much you want this to just end as quickly as possible. But imagine when we do infectious diseases, we keep raising animals, we keep giving them infections, we keep giving them cancer without painkillers. And so, these animals are literally the whole time in pain, in isolation, and that's just the physical pain, not to mention the psychological pain of isolation, being away from their families, and something else that we generally don't think about is imagine a child getting like a vaccine or a shot, and they often like cry obsessively. And the reason for that is not really the physical pain. It's the fact that they just don't know what's happening to their body. So as adults, it's still painful. You could argue that the amount of pain is not that different than, a child. But at least we can justify, we know that this person is not going to hurt us. We know why we are taking this drug when we get an injection. But for a child, they just don't know what's happening. They don't know the justification. They can't think logically. So just imagine when you grab an animal, and this is the simplest procedure to just like take them out of their cage, basically restrain them, take their blood, take their samples, do biopsy. And imagine you're a mouse and some other creature, 500 your times, grabs you. You don't know what's happening. You don't know if this person is going to kill you or, So the amount of stress and psychological pain is something that we often also don't think about when these animals are grown that way. But to answer your question that why it's happening, I think some of it is just the legal challenges, mandatory animal testing, which we had a big breakthrough last year on that when FDA removed the mandatory animal testing for certain cases. But that just shows you how much progress we still need to make, and how much these laws can actually dictate what happens to animals. So there is the legal impact, but at the same time, also scientists, a lot of people who do that are like old fashioned, and scientists are just like people, right? So they are, when they learn something, they don't want to change their minds. A lot of people who do these kind of things, they already spend a career doing animal testing. So now you're telling them that there is a better way to do things, right? So there is always a resistance. I think a part of it is just like us bringing this education to universities to talk about it, to make it okay for people to publish without animal testing. I'm a journal reviewer, and sometimes I see that people do animal testing literally just because they want to make sure their paper gets a chance to be published, because they have to show, quote unquote, what they do is clinically relevant. So their work has nothing to do with animal testing, but then they just do it at the end just to show that there is clinical relevance, which we can get into that later. That also just the fact that it works in a mouse doesn't mean that it's going to work in humans, and it can be actually misleading. But just to say that there is this expectations from scientists to keep doing it.
Yeah, I'm also curious to learn more about the FDA's removal of mandatory animal testing, but we can get to that when we discuss the policy side of things. But going back to the justification for a sec, I'm trying to put myself in the perspective of an average Joe, who I think they're coming in from a kind of a selfish human race perspective, where I think most people think, well, to test out ways to cure cancer, of course we don't want to test it out on humans. It's better to sacrifice some animals to do the testing. And we choose mice most of the time because mice, I think, have over 99% similarity with our DNA. That's why we choose them. And so I think the main justification for a lot of us is, well, let's sacrifice something which is very similar to us to test these things out for the benefit of the human race. to cure cancer, to cure COVID, to cure whatever for humans. So what are your thoughts on this justification?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly understand why we want to do that. To that, I have, I guess, two perspectives to share. One is the ethical perspective that would you be doing the same thing with your pet? So would you give me your pet so that I can inject them with cancer and make them suffer, burn their skin, keep them in isolation, torture them for the benefit of humanity? If your answer is no, then you already know that doing this to other animals should be wrong. So just because someone becomes your pet does not give them extra advantages. You already understand that all these animals can suffer. They can, and of course we learn something, but it doesn't justify doing it to them. We could make the same argument with humans. We could say, well, for the benefit of humanity, let's just do human testing forcefully on some people, right? Yes, they're gonna be miserable, they're gonna suffer, but it's gonna be good for the big picture, for the survival of humanity. We already know that's wrong. Even when you think about, let's do that with prisoners, let's do that with people who literally like rapists and murderers and people who clearly have done terrible things. Even when you think about like forcing them to be a part of animal testing, it's literally what Nazis did, right? So we already recognize just because we benefit from it, that doesn't make it right. Of course, if we do it on humans, we actually get a lot more benefit because it's human relevant. But we recognize that it doesn't make it right just because we learn something that can be helpful for humans. So I understand that for average Joe, there is a difference between human, animal, and other animals. So I get that. But the point that I'm making is that we can already see that just because we learn something new doesn't mean that we have the right to do it. So that's an ethical argument for it. But funny enough, we don't even actually have to go there, because I argue that we already have better alternatives that are safer for people. So if your argument is that you want to make sure that that's something that is safer for humans, then you are already advocating for alternatives to animal testing. I think one of the biggest misunderstandings with people is that they think if we don't test on animals, that means that we are putting humans in danger, which is completely opposite. It couldn't be farther away from truth. Not only animal testing is not helping, but also is holding us back. So the way to look at this is that if we didn't actually use animals for animal testing, if 100 years ago we started moving away from that, today we had such better alternatives that we would have been so much ahead of where we are today in terms of like advancing biomedical research. But of course, we are still using horses. We are still using pigeons. So again, to use that analogy, it's just imagine if people said, no, pigeons are essential for communication, which they were, 200 years ago. So imagine if people like persisted that, no, pigeons are essential. We're not going to move. They're good for communication. And imagine if today we were still using pigeons. You could argue every now and then they would benefit us for communication. They would have been probably better than nothing. But imagine if the technology stopped there. We didn't have telephones. We didn't have internet. But the fact that we didn't resist and we advanced, that's why we have so many better ways to communicate. So I think to just summarize, people need to understand that alternatives to animal testing means that it's not only better and ethical, but also it's better for people. It gives us opportunities to test new drugs, to do high throughput drug screening, to do testings that are actually human relevant. So, the cancer that you're testing, it's actually human relevant cancer, not treating cancer in mice. And then we can talk about why that 99% genetic identity or similarity doesn't really hold.
Yeah, let's talk about that before I ask my next question.
Yeah, so a very famous clinical trial is TGN 1412 that was done in England not that long ago, just a couple of years ago. The footage of this clinical trial is online on YouTube. You can actually go and look at the actual footage of the cameras, that what happened to these people. So this was phase 1 clinical trial, meaning that testing a new drug on healthy volunteers. Phase 1 clinical trial is generally very limited number of healthy individuals that you test your drug. Typically, it comes after preclinical studies, which is another name for animal testing. So in this case...
So phase 1 is testing on humans?
Yes. So clinical trials are always on humans, but preclinical studies means testing on animals, and lab testing, which is kind of included in that. But clinical trials, phase 1 is healthy volunteers, and phase 2 and 3 are basically patients or epidemiological studies. But yeah, so TGN 1412, before they went to healthy volunteers, they tested the drug in primates. And they tested it in 500 times more dosage than they would test it on humans, and they showed it was safe. That is a lot. 500 times extra dose in monkeys showed to be safe. So when they lowered the dosage by 500 times in humans, the side effects were so extreme, they had to basically amputate some of the volunteers' toes and fingers. They had so much inflammation, cytokine storm, that one of the participants was so inflamed that he looked like an elephant, and that's why the clinical trial is actually famous for Elephant Man clinical trial. And within minutes of injection of this drug, people had major organ failure, and all of that because we were over confident from animal testing. And these are monkeys. These are primates. We are primates, right? So that shows you that even when the immune system, in this case, their target, I believe it was a T-cell receptor, was like virtually identical to humans. But it just shows you that the very little difference in our genetic makeup makes a huge difference in the way that we react to drugs.
Right,
so,
and these are primates, which are even more related to us than mice, right?
Right. So just thinking about what percentage of our DNA is similar or identical is not the good way to look at this, because if you really think about it, I'm 40 to 44% like banana, right? Okay, I'm like sharing my DNA with banana, but I'm not 40% banana, right? So just because majority of DNA is identical with another species, that just doesn't say much. The same way that, like I mentioned, humans are not 40% bananas just because 40% of our DNA is banana.
Right.
So
can you repeat the name of the trial so I can add it to the show notes?
Yes, TGN 1412, or Elephant Man clinical trial.
Got it. Very interesting.
It shows you that, when we talk about genetic identity, that just doesn't say much. And another way to really think about it, just imagine a chimpanzee who is our closest evolutionary relative, right? So just imagine a chimpanzee and, I don't know, Albert Einstein side by side. All those hairs, the nose, the ears, the hairy body, their size, their intelligence, all of that comes in a fraction difference in our DNA. So you can imagine, just extend that to our immune system, extend that to our biochemistry. Or another prime example of that is like dogs, right? So dogs are mammals. Turn out if you give dogs chocolate, what happens? Chocolate is toxic to most mammals. So you see the problem there, right? Just because we share 99% over 95 or 99% of our DNA with other animals, that doesn't mean that the data we get from them is applicable to humans. Again, I take it back to animal testing. Imagine we give chocolate to a bunch of different mammals and we kill all of them. So that leads to misunderstanding in humans. We are going to say, okay, so chocolate is going to be toxic in humans because it was toxic in other animals. If it was a drug, it would have never made it to humans. If it failed in mice and dogs, we would have never tested in humans, but it could have had the potential to cure certain diseases. So you see how it's going to hold science back.
Yeah, it's a big fallacy, huh?
Yeah.
I really like your analogy on using pigeons for communication, which today would be completely unnecessary because we have much superior technology to do this, right? Such as phone, email, etc. So carrying that analogy to animal testing, what are some of the technologies or alternatives that we can use to replace animal testing?
So that's a good question. And something just before I answer that question is to realize that animal models are not the gold standard. So oftentimes people are looking for an alternative that works 100% of the time, right? So what is that alternative that just does not give you a false positive or false negative? It works all the time. Well, that doesn't exist, and neither animal testing is that accurate. So you just have to realize that animal testing oftentimes actually fails. So as long as you have something that is nearly as good or better, you already have a case. And I'm going to say that we already are there. And not only that, we are not in a perfect situation. We still need a lot of development. And these developments happen if we stop animal testing and invest in better models, right? So we need to first realize that pigeons are not good enough for communication. Horses are not good enough for transportation in order to invest in better cars, ships, planes, and all that. I just want to say that before we get into alternatives. But yes, when it comes to alternatives, for instance, there is in vitro testing. So these are testing that can be done in a lab. Now, these are simpler than animal testing, but they are human relevant. So it comes with pros and cons. Again, the pro here is that you can isolate molecules from humans. So when you do testing in the lab, you're actually using human relevant material. This is as opposed to when you test in an animal. The pro is that animals are complex, basically systems. They have multiple organs and you can look at different things. But the cons here is that, first of all, the complexity can lead to false positive and false negative, because then you get so much complexity outside of your control. And at the end of the day, the other con is that it's not human relevant. So yes, you learned how to cure cancer in mice, but that doesn't tell you anything about how to cure cancer in humans. And oftentimes we already cured cancer in mice many times, except that we never can do that in humans because humans are not giant mice. So in vitro human-related testing is a very good alternative. The other one is basically using high throughput robots and drug discovery screening machines. These robots can test thousands upon thousands of chemicals in a matter of hours or days. This is something that we can never do with animal testing. Animal testing is also not replicable just because animals vary as individuals. So when you do that with high throughput robots, you basically control the experiment so much better. So you have a better internal validity, meaning that your results are more reproducible. It's done by robots. You can do thousands upon thousands of drug screenings as opposed to animal testing. For animal testing is very expensive. Imagine if you have 1,000 drugs. There is no way that you can run 1,000 drug screening on animals. It just doesn't work that way. And remember, for animal testing, you need multiple animals per test. You need different sex and groups. So different sex per group. You need control. You need treatment. So it's not like one animal per drug, right? So you need probably tens of animals just per drug, and then it takes a lot of time as well.
So these machines that are used in high throughput testing, how exactly do they work?
So these are basically plates, what we call them as plates. They have, number of wells, 96 or even more wells per plate. So you can put your drug in each well. The robot takes care of all the pipetting and the screening, and all of it is going to be in vitro testing. So it could be based on, a number of different biochemical and biophysical assays that you can run, changing colors, there are many different ways to do that, but basically you have a robot that runs the entire process.
Right, and you're testing on human cells, right?
Human cells. It can be human cells. It can be also molecules that are from humans. So, for instance, I'm going to look at a certain protein in humans. I want to see what drug binds to this protein to either activate it or deactivate it. Where can I get that protein from? I can either isolate that protein directly from human blood. So people voluntarily donate blood. It finds its way to pharmaceutical business. You purify this protein, and then you can test it. Or you can actually produce this protein that is human protein in other organisms, such as like E. coli, such as yeast. It's called recombinant protein production. So you can purify it. You can then test that in a lab. And that's something very typical. It's not like rocket science. We do that all the time. Pretty much all biomedical research is done with recombinant protein. So it's a very easy and well understood technique to produce human relevant proteins and other material using this technology. So that's how you can do that. But when you use mouse, then you're testing this drug against a mouse version of that protein, which may or may not work the same way in humans, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So you mentioned in vitro testing, high throughput testing. What other techniques do we have?
And then, of course, a part of in vitro testing is also cell lines. So instead of giving mice human cancer, you can actually extract human cancers from human tumors and basically establish a cell line and test many different drugs and their combinations in a very well-controlled environment in these petri dishes and cell lines. So there's that.
Sorry, what is a cell line?
Cell line is basically when you isolate cells from a tumor or from a patient or from any animal, and then you basically characterize that cell you isolated, and then you start growing those cells in a way that you know that all these cells are genetically identical and they have the same characteristics. So then every time you want to test a drug, you basically take cells from this cell line that you established and characterized, and you use that for further testing. So every time you go back to that, you know that the cells are identical.
Got it. What else do we have?
Yeah, so then we have organoids. These are basically more advanced than cell lines. So in cell lines, you're using 2D cells. So these are basically just cells that you grow in a lab. But with organoids, these are actually tiny organs. And you can basically have organoids that mimic the function of brain to a degree. These are like pretty advanced, and Columbia University is using them. Texas Medical Center has developed mini brains that basically to maximize research.
Oh, wow. So they basically grow human brains in a lab.
Basically. So these are tissues. These are organs. So these are more complicated than just individual cells, right? Then another thing available to us is AI and machine learning, and basically the power of supercomputers. Again, to give you an idea, imagine your target molecule that you want to activate or deactivate is like a lock. And then you have a library of chemicals and you want to just see which one of these chemicals or which one of these keys open the lock, right? So how would you go about that? You can either go and grab every single key and test it against the lock and see which one opens it, and it takes as long as there are keys. Or you can use computers, and computers can look at the structure of all these keys, and computer can look at the structure of your lock and say, based on the data that I have, these keys have the potential to work with this lock. And the beauty of this is this can be done in a matter of like days or hours. These are like supercomputers. They look at the structure of food proteins or basically drugs. The technique is actually called docking. So it basically takes the structure of a protein, takes the structure of your drug, and it basically brings them. It looks at every orientation the drug and your target can actually interact and see at what point they could possibly fit and interact. And it will basically tell you that from these 1,000 drugs that you gave me, these 5 have potential to activate or deactivate your target. And then you can go back to your in vitro testing and actually test it in the lab and see which one works. So this is something that you could never do with animal testing. So that's another one. Another thing is phase 0 of clinical trials. So phase 0 is basically microdosing, and it's very intuitive, right? So every time you buy a new lotion, it always says, test it in a corner of your hand or something before you cover your face with it, just to see if you may have any kind of allergic reaction to it or something. So phase 0 of clinical trials is basically that. It's microdosing. So instead of giving people the full dose, you basically microdose them. And the beauty of it is if there is any severe drug interaction or side effects, then you can control them and they're not going to be that toxic or deadly. So for that clinical trial, for instance, TGN 1412, if instead of testing on monkeys to show that it's safe in humans, which turned out it wasn't, if we actually did microdosing, so instead of giving them a full dosage for humans, we gave them just a little bit, and we could measure that, these people clearly have some, mild reaction to this drug. We already would have stopped it, and there was no need to give them the full dosage because we were overconfident over animal data.
I was going to be a devil's advocate and counter that one of the disadvantages of doing in vitro testing is that you're only testing the effects on these isolated molecules or organelles, but you don't know the side effects on the entire human body. So would coupling this with microdosing on humans, would this be the ideal strategy to test out the side effects on the entire human body?
Yes, so that would basically solve that problem. In addition, again, I guess it's very important to realize that you're not comparing this to an actual gold standard. So it's not like if you actually tested that in animals, you would learn something that is human relevant, right? So what is your other alternative if you don't do this? To test it on animals, to test it on a mouse, right? But then the question is, will you be able to take that information and say that this is exactly what's going to happen in humans? Of course not. We've shown that many times. It may happen to work in humans as well, but it's purely based on luck. So there is no guarantee. You can never say because it worked in mice or because it failed, it's going to do the same thing in humans. And as a matter of fact, if it fails in mice, it could still have potential to work in humans, but you would never develop that drug. You would never make it to clinical trials because it failed in humans. Just imagine how many opportunities to treat, top killers, we just missed because we had to stop because they didn't work in animals, right? So how many potential candidates just never made it to humans just because they failed in animal models? And vice versa. How many times something worked in animal models, but we took it in humans, we spent time, we spent money, it ended up either completely failing or even worse, hurting patients like TGN 1412, right? So you realize how testing on animals not only prevents us from finding better drugs, but also it can actually be deadly. So if you care about patients, if you care about humans, don't think that animal models are helping that much. In cases that they happen to help, those are basically very limited numbers that happen to work in both other animals and humans. And there is microdosing, but then you also have human volunteers. Now, human volunteers, people might feel uneasy about this, but here is something that you need to know. Sometimes there are patients that are waiting for an experimental drug to be developed for them, and they don't have a plan B. So I work in a pharmaceutical company. We were developing an antibody for inflammation, to reduce inflammation for pancreatic cancer patients. So these were stage 4 pancreatic cancer patients, meaning that they only had 3 months to live. So the drug we were developing could only help them feel better and suffer less throughout those 3 months. There is no hope for these patients, unfortunately. So, but these patients couldn't have our drug, despite the fact that our drug was shown to be safe in vitro using like relevant cells. Not only that, but also our drug, I don't want to go into details, but our drug was biosimilar to other drugs that have been shown safe to both other animals and humans. So there was a case that we could make that this drug is so similar to what already has been shown to be safe in humans. We have a lot of data to show that it's been safe in vitro. But guess what? These patients couldn't have these drugs even when they wanted it because we were mandated to test on animals. And what that generally means is that it's going to take between 3 to 5 years. And these patients just simply don't have that much time. So put yourself in place of these patients. Imagine you're suffering, you have 3 months. At that point, every drug on market has failed you, and you have this experimental drug that is your only hope to feel better or possibly to cure your disease. But guess what? You can't have it because it has to go through 5 years or 3 years of animal testing. And guess what? If it happens to fail in animal testing, then no one will ever have that drug. So these are ways that we are putting patients in danger. We are killing people because we are mandating animal testing. And I guess most people are also familiar with organs on chips. So these are basically organs that are grown on tiny chips or microfluidic devices. And to my shock, actually I always thought that these are not complex systems because you're just looking at lung or whatever tissue, but you can actually have multiple organs on these tissues and see how different organs are working together. And again, is it as complex as a body, an animal body? Of course not. But again, it doesn't mean that when you test it on mice, it's not human relevant at all. But with organs on chips, it's going to be human relevant. So that's a benefit. That's a huge benefit.
Got it. Anything else you want to add on these alternative techniques and the best strategies to use with them?
It's basically so organs on chips and in vitro testing and using cell lines, all these have the benefit of advancing personalized medicine. So what personalized medicine means is that currently, if you have cancer, the way it's going to work is you're going to see your doctor. They probably would give you certain chemo. And as many other drugs, if you've noticed, you see a doctor, they say, test this, come back to me in 3 months and see how you feel. And if it's not working, then we're going to try something else. Why can't they know if the drug is going to work? Because we are genetically, even between humans, we are genetically diverse enough that there is no guarantee that this drug, the way that it's going to work in me, is going to be identical in you. So personalized medicine is a solution to that problem. So if you have cancer, we can take your cancer cells, we can grow it in the lab, we can test different chemo in the lab on your cancer and see which one is going to work, because certain cancers could be resistant to certain chemo, and there is no way for us to know that unless we do genetic testing, or we take these cells in the lab and test different types of chemo and see what works. So this is amazing. Personalized medicine is going to be the future of medicine, and it's going to reduce a lot of side effects, a lot of, wasting time, money, all that. So, and this is something that literally is the future of medicine, and it's all about alternatives to animal testing. This is not anything that we can be doing with animals.
Very fascinating. So you shared with us a lot of these promising alternatives that are clearly better than animal testing, which can often generate a lot of false positives, false negatives, and just set us behind in terms of medical advancement. So since we already have all of these solutions, what's the trend been for animal testing? Has it gone down in recent years?
I think it's one of the things that we, there's like 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards. Some countries ban cosmetic testing or some states, and then they go back. There is a constant fight, unfortunately. And it's also important to realize that there is a whole business behind it, for, businesses that sell animals for animal testing. So because of that, the progress is slow, but that just means that we need to focus more on education, on alternatives, convince the government, and really focusing on the fact that it saves people. It's better for people. I think that's a very good argument to be made, that it's cheaper, it's safer, it's faster, it saves lives. And, governments don't really care about animals, but everybody cares about saving money and saving lives. So we really have to focus on these and basically try to fight until we have these goals set in place.
So to summarize, I just want to make sure I get this correct. The rough trend is animal testing is starting to be banned in some places, but at the same time, it's also being outsourced to other places, which I assume might have a cheaper cost.
Yeah, or some countries. For instance, there are places in the US that they don't really want to test on animals, but then they export their products to China, and then China's government really requires animal testing. So they don't want to do it in the US, but in order to have a market in another country, they have to do it. So, the solution for that is either they lose their market in the US because they're testing on animals, which can happen. And, a lot of companies that don't test on animals and they have that brand that is cruelty-free, some do care about animals, but some also realize that it's a marketing decision for them, because they know that if they advertise that as cruelty-free, if it is cruelty-free, then they appeal to another group of people. And the good thing about animal testing, especially when it comes to cosmetic and different things, is that public is actually pretty much against it. So that's a very good thing that we have to defend our case, that typically just public, if you ask people, no one really wants to test laundry detergent in rabbits' eyes. Everyone recognizes that we should have better alternatives. So we have to harvest that potential.
Okay, let's move on to the policy side of things now. You mentioned a few times that animal testing is mandatory for a lot of cases. For example, the treatment for pancreatic cancer that you mentioned, the patient has to wait 3 to 5 years for it to get FDA approved. And for it to get approved, you need to do animal testing. So what's the state of policy right now, and what types of things still require animal testing?
I think we are making a lot of progress, and it just shows you how much these laws can impact the state of science. So we just got FDA Modernization Act 2.0 passed thanks to Senator Cory Booker and another Republican. It was a bipartisan case. But just to show you how crazy it is, the FDA Modernization Act, the first version, was basically set in place around World War II, where computers weren't a thing. So this was before invention of modern computers, right? So with World War II technology, imagine like the medical technology back then. So back then, it was determined that animal testing was necessary and mandatory. And we've been doing that the whole time, despite the fact that today we have like AI technology, we have computers, we have so many other alternatives that I just mentioned. And none of that was included in the law. And the law is still not perfect. So it's mostly about cases where you can show that it's like biosimilar, then you don't have to test on animals. But another good news is that, like, for instance, I visited EPA's headquarters in Research Triangle, and, EPA is dropping all mammalian testing by 2035. So unfortunately, it's a long time, but you can see that they're dropping mammalian testing, which is, still a good step. And every step when you take, that means that there is more money for alternatives. There's going to be more data to show how alternatives are more accurate. It makes a case that if EPA can show that water is safe, air is safe, these toxic chemicals that they're testing, they do a lot of toxicology. So if EPA gets to do toxicology without mammals, that means that, no one else should. That means that there is alternatives. A good way of generally thinking about it is like we already have cosmetics that are not tested on animals, like toothpaste, right? When was the last time that you use a vegan toothpaste that, after you used it, your teeth fell off, right? So I think like we can already agree that we can prove that these products are safe enough already when it comes to cosmetics. So there is no need to test these on, rabbit eyes and force-feed dogs laundry detergents to just confirm their safety. So that just, when we advance with laws, it makes it a lot easier for other companies to follow.
Right. So 2 follow-up questions. For the FDA 2.0 Act, what are some of the most noteworthy changes in regards to animal testing? And my second question is, you mentioned EPA. It's great that they are making progress. They've decided to remove mammalian testing by 2035. But, 2035, that is 12 years from now. So why does it take so long if they've already decided to do it? Why does it take 12 years?
Yeah, so FDA Modernization Act 2.0, I think allows development of drugs that are biosimilar to other molecules that we already have shown their safety. So if you can show that these are similar molecules, I think you can skip animal testing, which is still a big progress. And to answer your second question, the reason that it just takes a long time is because some of the alternative animal testings, they have to be validated. So we have to do them enough to compare to animal testing and just basically make a case that, accumulate data basically to show that it works and it's better. But at the same time, when you have, generally biomedical research is very slow, like any other system, right? Just imagine when we had computers, then you had to go from governmental agencies to go from like filing everything as like hard copy to computers. And then you always have a long transition. So with science, it's always just like that, except worse because, when we learn how to do something, we just don't want to change that. We gather so much. People are so comfortable with things with the way things are that they just don't want to change them quickly. So that's why it takes a long time. There are basically, in summary, there are two reasons. One is we just need to accumulate more data and over time increase our confidence. And second is just because bureaucracy and how long things take when it comes to government. It's not because we just don't know how good alternatives are.
Right. To clarify, what exactly does the EPA do, or what cases would this apply to?
For like toxicological tests, for let's say they're concerned about whether this compound is toxic for the environment or not. Whether it's you buy any chemical for the labs, behind it says the lethal dosage for this animal, for is it like a skin irritant? Is it like an eye irritant? All this testing that EPA has to perform, all of it is going to be done using either in vitro tests or basically alternatives.
Got it. So I'd like to use this channel to empower our listeners to impact change. So for the average Joe who's listening to this and they feel passionate about reducing animal testing, what can they do to influence policy or influence change?
Just like anything else, I think speak up. Every time that you see something is wrong, please speak up and say something and try to convey your concern. Remember that for all these companies, they survive because we pay for them, right? So and a lot of people refuse to buy these products. But remember, just by refusal, you're not necessarily sending a message. But if you actually proactively refuse to buy a product because it's been tested on animals, write a review, send them an email, and basically help them that way. The other way is that there are a lot of nonprofits that work on alternatives to animal testing. They take care of education. They take care of these campaigns. So that includes PCRM, or Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. They're amazing. So please follow their work. There is PETA. PETA has a very good center for alternatives to animal testing. You can check that out. Another organization is the White Coat Waste Project. And another one is Center for Contemporary Sciences. And their CEO is Aisha Akhtar. She's an MD and MPH, Master of Public Health. So these organizations, they all advocate for alternatives to animal testing. Support them. You can support them with money, donations, of course, or signing their petitions. So these are the ways that you can contribute. But then on a personal level, just when you see something is wrong, please do something. I give you an example. Like as a scientist, I go to a lot of conferences, and a lot of times I see I give you a actual example. So I went to biophysics conference earlier this year, and a part of biophysics is electrophysiology. So looking at neurons and electricity, how basically neurons work. And there is literally this torture device. I don't really have any other way to describe it, where you restrain a mouse and you basically give them electrical shock. And, I went and asked for alternatives. I said, why are you using this? And I will not support this because, for these reasons. And, it just takes more people to proactively say something. When you see something is wrong, say something. So write reviews, write emails, and, support others who do this.
I'm just trying to pinpoint what's the thing that can have the most impact. You mentioned a lot of good suggestions there. So speaking up, writing reviews, sharing with others, and just being more proactive. But a lot of these drugs or products, they can't be passed by the FDA unless animal testing is done. So would you say policy is the limiting factor here?
Yeah, policy makes a huge impact. And not only that, but also it allows exploring alternatives and improving alternatives. But the way that policies work is typically a lot of organizations, such as the ones that I named, they work with policymakers like Cory Booker, for instance, and then they can introduce these laws so they can get passed. So the way that it works is basically when the politician is supporting animal testing, then, you can voice your concern by calling their office, senators or U.S. representatives or anyone, writing letters. So yeah, it's that, or supporting organizations that change policy. Because like any other policy, you have to, influence the votes, right? So it's your voting and telling them that this is not something that you want done with your tax money. And also, I guess another thing that is important is just showing the truth of what happens to animals, because most people really don't have a clear vision of what animal testing looks like. And fun fact is it's always banned to be recorded and published. So that was the big red flag for me. So we had like a biomedical ethics class, and in the class before they prepared us to go and visit the animal facility, they said, no pictures allowed or recording. And I remember I said, why? We are like a public university. It's being done with taxpayers' money. And they said, well, if people see that, they may get emotional, quote unquote. And then I said, if this is done by their tax money, don't they have the right to see what happens with their money? So just know that, like anything else, if people see the actual footage, if they see what's happening to these animals, most people don't want to support it. And the fact that, you educate public that moving away from animal testing only means that we are going to have safer and better ways to advance science.
Would you say supporting these organizations, signing petitions, is that enough to speed things up? Because like you mentioned, FDA version 1 that has been done during World War II, and only now are we working towards version 2.0, the Modernization Act. So, why does it take so long? And is there any impactful way we can speed things up? Because at the end of the day, even if everyone changes their minds, everyone is against animal testing, but if the law still requires that all these drugs need to undergo animal testing to be approved, then people still need to do it, even though they might be against it, right? So I feel like that's one of the biggest hurdles that we need to target.
It's like anything else where you want to change the law. It's not going to happen. There is no easy and fast solution for it, unfortunately. But it means that two things have to happen simultaneously. One is pressure on politicians by public and by scientists. And second is basically individual actions that educate public on it. But there is no easy solution. It's like anything else, like gun control or like, I don't know, abortion or anything else. Just, you see how long these things take to, and then how much back and forth is involved. But with animal testing, hopefully it's not like that, but more like it just takes time to change laws. But I would say if there are any students watching this or listening to this, just know that, if you attend a class where they are mandating students to do animal testing, if there are, or not, or even not mandating, but for, no reason they're doing dissection or anything like that, just know that how much power you have to actually change this. There are lots and lots of labs that are being shut down throughout the country because students start a campaign and they take support from organizations that I mentioned, and then over time within one generation we literally just like shut down these labs. So know that you have that power. So if there is a lab that does animal testing, and if a student is dedicated enough, know that they have that power to make a huge deal and make significant changes for at least those animals. And every time that we do that, it builds up the case for other instances. And also for students who are working on computer sciences, STEM students, just know that you can always dedicate your career and your research to finding better alternatives. And every time that you do that, you are making the case stronger and stronger and make the transition faster.
Yeah, 100% agree. Students can make a huge impact on their campuses. I remember when I was an undergrad at the University of British Columbia back in the days, there was still a lab that was doing testing on monkeys, but within like 3 to 4 years, that lab has shut down due to just students protesting against animal testing. So, yeah, whether you're a student or someone in the workforce, you have the ability to impact change. Systems are not set in stone, and rules are meant to be broken. I just have a question that popped up. So, for cosmetics, right, if people feel very passionate against animal testing, then they can, of course, boycott these products and go for quote-unquote cruelty-free products. And if the demand changes enough, then this can definitely cause suppliers to shift their focus on more animal-friendly products. And I mean, this trend has been increasing over the recent years. But for drugs and other medicines, number one, how can people determine if animal testing had been done? And number two, is it even possible to boycott these like you would consumer products and go for cruelty-free alternatives? Like, I would assume a lot of these medicines, you're stuck with a limited number of options, all of which have to be animal tested. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a good question, and there is no clear answer here. There are cases where you could actually do that. You could request a drug that is not tested on animals, or at least it's not developed based on animal research. An example of that is the flu shot. So you can always ask for the egg-free version that is vegan, and some centers actually provide that. It's probably not because they really care about animals, but in that case, like for egg allergy, there is alternatives. So sometimes there are alternatives. Sometimes you can think about how necessary it is to take this medication. Are we talking about life-threatening thing that you have to take, or is it like a flu vaccine that you can decide whether you want to take it or not? But at the end of the day, majority of drugs have been tested on animals. And I think the right way to ask this question is not, about the drugs that we already have available, but where we are going with this. So 50 years from now, do we want to still be using pigeons for communication? Do we still want to be relying on horses? Or do we want to be in a more advanced society? So I think a lot of our focus should be more like, where should we put our investment in terms of money, research, time, education, rather than trying to see what drugs are tested on animals, because it's going to be pretty much every drug at this point.
All right, it's time to start wrapping things up here. I'm curious to hear your story and background a bit more. I see that you've started the Allied Scholars for Animal Protection. You're part of the Good Food Institute. So, yeah, how did you get into all of this?
Basically, the question for me always was, how can I be the most impactful in what I do? And I wasn't familiar. I didn't know what I know today. So at some point, I was really curious about fixing the environment. So I did chemical engineering. Then I felt really bad about cancer. So I wanted to do cancer research, which is what I did. And then after my doctorate, I really wanted to work on pandemics and really clinical research. So that's what I did. But really, every time I noticed that it always comes back to the food system. So whether it's pandemics, antibiotic resistance, top causes of death, such as cardiovascular diseases and cancer, it always comes back to animal consumption. And that's why I decided that the best thing I can do, and honestly anyone, is to work on the food system. Because if you want to save the environment, if you want to prevent pandemics, literally the top causes of death in the world, the biggest threat, in biomedical research, for instance, the biggest threat to human life is antibiotic resistance, and the pandemic that is antibiotic resistant. So We know that 80% of antibiotics in the US and globally is fed to animals, these are like medically relevant antibiotics that lead to antibiotic resistance. So literally anything that is important comes back to animal consumption, and that's why the best thing that we can be doing is to do that.
So just wanted to clarify, you mentioned a lot of these antibodies are fed to animals, and then it leads to antibiotic resistance in us. Is that correct? Or like, how does this all work?
The way it works is that antibiotics that we consume get secreted to the environment. So there are two ways that antibiotic resistance develops. One is that you keep suppressing bacteria with antibiotics. So in humans, for instance, if you don't finish your antibiotic course and you give up as soon as your symptoms go away, there will be certain bacteria that survive and they get a chance to actually replicate. So now you have a bacterium that is antibiotic resistant, and then you can pass that to other people. So in the future, if those people get the same infection and take the same antibiotics, it's not going to work in them. So there's that. And then other thing is that antibiotics get secreted out. And it finds its way to water, to groundwater, to the environment, and that's how antibiotic resistance can spread. And when it goes to water, it can be found on other plants, on other animals, and then people are exposed to these animals. People are exposed to animal products. It comes in contact with humans. Humans go to hospitals, then it spreads in hospitals, and that's how you literally start a new pandemic with antibiotic resistance.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, basically, I just wanted to work on the root cause of all these issues, and also knowing that the amount of suffering involved, the amount of number of, the number of individuals who are impacted, in this case, billions of animals in addition to humans. It always comes down to animal consumption. So that's why I work at GFI, Good Food Institute. We develop the science and technology for better alternatives, alternative proteins. And also with my nonprofit, we basically promote veganism in universities because it's completely lacking in universities. And we believe that we earlier talked about lawmakers, but we really want to train the future lawmakers and politicians and lawyers and scientists who understand that whatever they're interested in, they can apply it to veganism and animal advocacy, and understand that if they are becoming an environmentalist, if they are becoming a politician, they can be educated that a lot of issues that they're going to be working with are going to be related to animal consumption. And if they really want to be effective, they should be focusing on that.
So your organization, the Allied Scholars for Animal Protection, can you give us more details on that? Like, what exactly do you do to empower students to promote animal protection in universities?
Yeah, so ASAP, or Allied Scholars for Animal Protection, is my nonprofit. It's a tax-exempt nonprofit that I started. Our work includes starting registered student organizations and chapters in all top universities in the US. And then what we do, our work has 3 pillars. One is outreach. So we are constantly on campus doing outreach, reaching out to new vegans, making new vegans, and basically building the community there. The second pillar is education and empowerment. So that's when we basically bring all this education that we are talking about today to universities. We train medical students on nutrition of plant-based diet, and we try to have career workshops for vegans so they understand that if they're into environment, law, policy, whatever they are interested in, they can make it about veganism. And we basically empower them to make sure that they can be effective advocates even after graduation. And then the third pillar is working with dining halls to go plant-based, and that way we make it easy for everyone in universities to be vegan. So we are building a positive feedback loop that it's sustainable, and we train the future leaders that graduate only to become the next generation of thought leaders. So basically, we are training the next Cory Bookers and Eric Adams.
Nice. And quick question on the Good Food Institute. What are some of the notable results or accomplishments that you've seen from them recently?
So Good Food Institute has many different departments that work on science and technology, which is where I am, as well as policy work. For instance, there was a whole thing about, plant-based milks not being able to use the word milk. And we know that this is something that is happening in Europe as well. Dairy industry is fighting back because, their end is near, so they want to fight back. Good Food Institute tried to work with policymakers, and, we made sure that it didn't happen. So that's one accomplishment, for instance. Or that when the government is trying to explore increasing manufacturing capacity in the U.S., the policy team works with them, with the government, gives them information. And that's why for the first time, Biden's administration is including alternative proteins, including cultivated meat in their agenda, which is a big accomplishment. Then we do a lot of exploration of what are missing, how to scale up alternative proteins, and basically what are the gaps so we can put money and grants and support in those areas to make sure that the field as a whole advances as quickly as possible. And everything we do is open source. So that's another benefit because we are nonprofit. And so we make everything publicly available so everyone can use.
Nice. I'll definitely share all these resources in the YouTube description or the show notes of this episode. From your years of experience in this space, if you could distill down to 3 main lessons or call to actions that you would like to share with our audience, what would that be?
If you are young or you have the potential, definitely dedicate your career to it. And if you don't know how, you can contact me. I'll help you. But just know that whatever you're doing, whether it's, computer sciences, whether it's social work, whether it's art, anything you do, you can make it about veganism. And I guarantee you that there is nothing as impactful as promoting veganism that you can be doing with your life. I challenge you to show me that there is something else that can save more lives, can reduce suffering more than promoting veganism. And if you show me that, I'll quit my job. I'll go do that, but there's not. So I think the best thing that you can do is to dedicate your future. And if you can't change your career, you can always donate your money to organizations that do this kind of thing. And remember that these people exist. And for them to support, they need financial support. So if you can't do it yourself, you can always support others that do that. And last thing is, please don't be silent. Just know that you have the power. Use your voice. Make a difference around you. Every time you see animal cruelty, every time you see animal abuse, say something. I think there is a lot of pressure on us to be quiet because our message is inconvenient. No one likes to hear that their food choices, their purchases are hurting animals. So as a result, there is an expectation for us not to be vocal to, of course, like people want to be, living in ignorance. Ignorance is a bliss. No one really wants to get educated. which only means how important it is for us to speak up. So as long as you do something, I think you're good. Just know that in the face of injustice, silence is not an option.
So I'm a pretty big introvert. I hate confronting random people in the public and just talking to strangers. So what advice would you give introverts like me to push myself to speak up?
That's funny you say that because I'm also an introvert. And another perspective to just look at this is that it's not about what you're comfortable doing. It's about what needs to be done. I'm in front of cameras way more than I'm comfortable. Every time I see myself, I hear to my own podcast or like my voice, I hear my own speeches, I cringe. It never stopped being annoying for me to be in front of cameras. I always have to put myself out of my comfort zone. But the only reason I do that is because we need to be talking about this. So I think removing ourselves from the center of problem and putting animals, the real victims, at the center would really help us clarify what needs to be done. And so just a fresh perspective, right? So it's not always about what we want to do. It's more about what needs to be done and what needs to be said. So there's that. I also say that a lot of things are skills that people can learn. For instance, when I go on the street to talk to people, English is not even my first language. I'm an introvert, but the skills that I picked up by just being trained really helped me to be more confident about what I say or what I do. But at the end of the day, not every activism is just like going to a street and just talk to people. But when it comes to advocacy, it's like a lot about publications, making podcasts, making videos, putting content online, diffusing all this spread of misinformation, right? Saying something when you see something is wrong. And in your personal life, when you're talking to, your partners, your parents, your friends, and all of that. And introverts can still like donate money. If they make enough, they can just, support others. And like, there is a ton of people that I support on Patreon. And it doesn't have to be like $200, but like even like, $2, $5 monthly, to a lot of activists that do this full time, that allows them to survive and be doing that, more sustainably.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And another thing that really helps me is, I assume most of our listeners are at least in their 20s. And let's say the average human lives around like 80 to 90 years. So we only have around 60 to 70 years left, which is roughly 20-something thousand days left. That's not a huge number, right? And each day is a chance for you to influence change, right? There's so many opportunities every day, whether it's speaking with your colleagues or friends or family or encountering some incidents where you can speak up to raise more awareness about the issues you're passionate about. And each day you don't speak up is one day lost. And, you're only left with 20-something thousand days left in your life. Time is ticking. So each day you don't speak up is one more missed opportunity. And I think this fear of regretting to not do something when I'm given the opportunity, and this something can have the ability to improve the lives of billions of animals in the future. I think this regret pushes me to speak up and take action, even though I'm an introvert. But thank you so much for all your insights. I learned so much from this episode. Please hand off to the audience where they can contact you, learn more about your work, or any other resources you would like to share.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me and playing your own role to spread this information. I really appreciate that. To contact me, one of the best ways would be using our website, alliedscholars.org. There is a contact form there and it'll come to me directly. You can also follow my work on Twitter and YouTube, and my handle is Dr. Faraz Harsini. And you can contact me through that as well.
Perfect. I'll add all of these links in the show notes or the YouTube description of this episode. Thank you so much again for coming on, and let's definitely keep in touch.
Of course, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That's it for today's episode of Ecochat. If you enjoyed it, we'd appreciate it if you could leave a rating and review on whatever podcast platform you use. We're also on Twitter and YouTube. It really helps others find our show in the search algorithm. With that, thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time on Ecochat.